Here's a question that keeps coming up in comments and in therapy rooms, and it goes something like this. I have ADHD or I'm autistic, and my therapist mentioned attachment issues, but I don't know what that means or whether it even applies to me. It's a fair question, and the honest answer is these things are genuinely connected, but not in the way a lot of online content suggests. So today I'm going to walk through what attachment theory actually says, where it came from, what it means developmentally, and then look at how ADHD and autism each interact with it in their own distinct ways. This isn't going to be a quick list of attachment styles and which one you are. It's going to be a bit more grounded than that. Attachment theory was developed by a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby, starting in the 50s and running through the 80s. He was trained as a psychoanalyst, but he was deeply dissatisfied with how psychoanalysis explained early childhood development. He thought the field had it backwards, too focused on fantasy and internal drives, not focused enough on what was actually happening between children and their caregivers in real life. So Bowlby built a new framework. His core argument was this: human infants are born biologically prepared to form a close bond with a primary caregiver. This isn't just about feeding or comfort in the moment. It's a survival strategy. An infant who stays close to a protective adult has a much better chance of making it. Bowlby called this the attachment behavioral system, and he argued it's as fundamental to human development as eating or sleeping. The other piece Bowlby introduced was something called the internal working model. As a child has repeated experiences with their caregiver, you cry, someone comes, you're scared, someone soothes you, you reach out, someone responds. The child builds up a kind of mental model, a set of expectations about whether other people are going to be available and responsive, and whether the child themselves is worthy of that care. That internal working model doesn't stay locked in infancy. It travels with the person. It shapes how they approach relationships for a long time. Then in the late 60s and 70s, a developmental psychologist named Mary Ainsworth did something crucial. She actually went into homes and watched mothers and infants interact. Then she brought those same children into a lab setting, a procedure called the strange situation, and observed how they responded to brief separations from their caregivers and then reunions. What she found was that children fell into distinct patterns. Some children, the ones she called securely attached, used their caregiver as a base. They'd explore, they'd get upset when the caregiver left, and they'd settle quickly when the caregiver came back. The caregiver's response in the home had been consistently sensitive and attuned. Other children showed what Ainsworth called anxious ambivalent attachment. They were hard to soothe at reunion, clingy but also resistant. Their caregivers had been inconsistent at home, sometimes available, sometimes not, which left the child in a state of heightened vigilance about whether care was coming. A third group, avoidant, seemed almost indifferent to the separation and the reunion, but physiological measures showed they were actually highly stressed. They'd learned to suppress attachment behavior because their caregivers had consistently been dismissive or uncomfortable with emotional closeness. Mary Main later identified a fourth pattern, disorganized attachment, where children showed no coherent strategy at all. This pattern was more common in contexts involving trauma, fear, or situations where the caregiver was both a source of comfort and a source of fear. The key thing to hold on to here is that attachment patterns in this tradition are about the fit between a child and their caregiving environment. They're relational, they're not diagnoses. They're adaptive responses to the environment the child actually experienced. Now, what happens when you bring ADHD into this picture? ADHD affects executive function, attention regulation, emotional regulation, and impulse control. And all of those things play a role in how a parent and child relate to each other, on both sides. Let's start with the child. An infant or toddler with ADHD, even before it's identified, tends to be more difficult to soothe, more reactive, more unpredictable in terms of sleep and arousal. They may have more intense emotional responses. They may be harder to read. They may not respond to caregiving in ways that parents expect. This can strain the caregiving relationship, not because anything is wrong with the child or the parent, but because the interaction patterns that typically build secure attachment are harder to establish. It takes more effort, more attunement, more flexibility. Parents who have good support and low stress can often navigate this well. Parents who are isolated, overwhelmed, or who themselves have unmanaged ADHD or anxiety may find it a lot harder. And that's another layer. ADHD is highly heritable. If a child has ADHD, there's a real chance that one or both parents do too. And a parent with ADHD may struggle with consistent, responsive caregiving that supports secure attachment. Not because they don't love their child or don't want to show up, but because consistency and sustained attention are genuinely hard for them. Research has found higher rates of insecure attachment in children with ADHD compared to children without. But the relationship isn't deterministic, it's probabilistic, and it's modifiable. Context matters a lot. Now, fast forward to adulthood. Adults with ADHD often describe real difficulties in relationships, not just with partners, but in terms of internal experience of connection. There's a phenomenon called rejection-sensitive dysphoria, which isn't a formal diagnosis, but describes something many people with ADHD report: extreme, intense emotional pain in response to perceived rejection or criticism. When someone feels, even fleetingly, that they've disappointed or have been abandoned by someone important to them, the emotional response can be overwhelming and disproportionate to what actually happened. If you overlay this with an anxious or disorganized attachment pattern, the combination can be pretty destabilizing in relationships. The person isn't just responding to what's in front of them. They're responding to a history of experiences processed through a nervous system that's already running hot. There's also the question of emotional regulation. Secure attachment in Bowlby's framework is partly about having an internal model that says, when I'm distressed, help is available. Over time, that model becomes the basis for self-regulation. The ability to soothe yourself, to tolerate discomfort, to manage big feelings without external support. If that foundation is shaky and executive function is compromised, the person is working with fewer tools when things get hard. Autism is a different conversation, and it's important to keep it separate from ADHD, even though the two frequently co-occur. Autism involves differences in social communication, sensory processing, and pattern of interests and behaviors. And for a long time, there was a mistaken assumption, including within some clinical circles, that autistic children didn't attach, or attached less, or were fundamentally less interested in social connection. That's not what the evidence shows. What the research actually suggests is that autistic children do form attachments to their caregivers. The strange situation, studies that were conducted with autistic children found that autistic toddlers also use their caregiver as a safe base, and they also show distress at separation. The pattern of attachment isn't absent, but the way it's expressed can look different. Here's the important distinction. Autism affects social communication. It affects how children signal their emotional states, how they make eye contact, how they use gesture and facial expression and vocalization to connect with others. So an autistic child might be experiencing strong attachment to their caregiver, but expressing it in ways the caregiver doesn't immediately recognize or know how to respond to. That mismatch between how the child is communicating and how the caregiver is reading it can itself create stress in the relationship on both sides. The caregiver may feel uncertain, unsure whether they're getting it right, unsure whether the child is truly connecting. The child may feel frustrated or dysregulated when their bids for connection don't land the way they intend. There's also the sensory dimension. Caregiving involves a lot of physical contact, holding, rocking, feeding. For a child who has sensory sensitivities, some of that contact may feel uncomfortable or may need to be delivered differently. A caregiver who isn't aware of this may misread the child's response as rejection. The child isn't rejecting connection. They're responding to something sensory. Now, one area where the conversation gets more complicated is the question of masking. Many autistic people, particularly those who are diagnosed later in life, and especially autistic women, spend years developing elaborate strategies to appear neurotypical in social situations. This is cognitively and emotionally exhausting. And there's an interesting question about what masking does to the internal working model. If someone has spent a long time performing connection rather than actually being in it, calibrating their behavior to what they think others expect, suppressing their natural responses, constantly monitoring, that affects how they experience relationships. Not because they don't want genuine connection, but because the gap between the performed self and the actual self can make intimacy feel either exposing or exhausting or both. Some autistic adults, particularly those who found community and understanding later in life after years of feeling like they were doing relationships wrong, describe something like a reorganization of their attachment experience. When the environment actually responds to who they are, rather than who they were performing being, something shifts. So what's the actual takeaway here? Attachment theory, in the developmental tradition, is fundamentally about relationships. It's about what happens between people, specifically what happens when a child reaches out and whether the environment responds in a way that's reliable, sensitive, and safe. The patterns that develop out of those early experiences aren't destiny, but they do shape how people move through relationships later. ADHD and autism both affect the caregiving relationship from both directions. A child who is harder to read, harder to soothe, or whose communication looks different can be more challenging to attune to. A parent who is also neurodivergent or who lacks support may have a harder time providing consistent responsiveness. None of that is blame. It's just a way of understanding why these populations show up with higher rates of insecure attachment patterns and why that's worth paying attention to clinically. The hopeful part, and Bowlby himself was clear on this, is that internal working models are not fixed. They update. Relationships that are consistently responsive can shift expectations over time. Therapy can do this. Stable partnerships can do this. Community can do this. The model isn't locked in place by childhood. If you're neurodivergent and you've been exploring attachment as a framework for understanding your relationships, it's worth going back to the developmental literature rather than stopping at the 4 attachment styles. The richer question isn't what's my type? It's what was the environment like and what did I learn from it, and does that still serve me? That's the question worth sitting with. If this video resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and follow me for more videos. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.